Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all this afternoon to this inaugural from Professor Charlotte Clarke. I'm particularly pleased to see such a wide range of colleagues from across different parts of the college and the university, students, and particularly Charlotte's mother Elizabeth, who's travelled up from Leicester, so welcome. This is a particular pleasure for me. I've been working quite closely with Charlotte since she came to the university in 2011 because she took over on arrival as head of the School of Health and Social Science, and I have regular and quite close meetings and relationships with all the heads of schools, so I feel I've got to know Charlotte very well over that time, and I've really enjoyed working with her. So I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about the work that goes on that I'm less familiar with, which is her own research work this afternoon. So I'm sure many of you know Charlotte probably even better than I do, but I'm going to just give you a little bit of biographical background and detail because you probably all know different parts of her or parts of her work and perhaps don't have this whole picture. So Charlotte's first degree was in nursing studies from what was at the time the Glasgow College of Technology, but she then moved on to Northumbria University to get an MSc in Health and Social Research and a PhD in Dementia Care Nursing, and then later the higher doctorate of DSOC-SCI for her research on risk management in dementia care. Her first appointment as a professor was as a professor of nursing practice development research back in 2001, so this is not her first inaugural. And then, as I said, joined us here at the University of Edinburgh in 2011 as Professor of Health in Social Science, at the same time as taking on the headship of the school of the same name. She's also held other appointments, the adjunct chair with Griffith University in Australia since 2010, and an honorary contract with NHS North of Tyne. Now, her research interests have been very wide-ranging across the field of healthcare and nursing over her career, but there's been a focus and a concentration throughout on understanding dementia and on working with older people. I think one of the things that's very clear in working with Charlotte is how good a collaborator, how good a team player she is. And it's interesting to look at some of her career highlights and recognise the extent to which these are the result of being involved with or leading collaborative teams. So, for instance, her recent work with an international collaborative network on risk in ageing populations, which was initially funded by the British Academy and involved practitioners and academics from across the UK, India, Germany, Australia, USA and South Africa. She was also part of a team that won the Times Higher Education Award for Outstanding Knowledge Exchange and Knowledge Transfer Team of the Year for 2010. And then this year, she was awarded first prize in the Health and Social Care category of the BMA Medical Book Awards. And this was a book that she worked on jointly with Heather Wilkinson from here and two other colleagues, called Risk and Dementia Care, Approaches to Everyday Living. So I think that gives a flavour of not only the breadth of her work, but also her expertise around understanding dementia and understanding care in dementia. And I think we'll all be looking forward to hearing a bit more about this from Charlotte in her lecture, Phew, for a minute there I lost myself, the experience of living with dementia. Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. This is a pure indulgence, I feel. What a luxury to be able to just spend a bit of time with you and talk about some of the things that have kind of shaped some of my thinking over the last, throughout my research career. I've titled this, Phew, for a minute there I lost myself, because that whole notion of what does that mean to lose yourself, I want to explore. And I want to link it into some of the work that I and colleagues have been doing around risk theories. And what I'll do towards the end of the presentation, just briefly, is reflect on some of the experiences of conducting research in this field, but perhaps research as such, and some of the things that have mattered to me in working with other people to do this. It was right back in 1901 that we can identify the first person who was believed to have dementia. And 4 days after Augusta Dita was admitted to hospital, Alzheimer, wrote in her notes then, this was just a few years before she died, the patient is not able to progress in writing and repeats, I have lost myself. So it's always been there, but what does that mean, to lose oneself? If we spin forward to now, dementia is one of the top policy concerns, one of the top societal concerns, one of the top medical concerns that there are. Wellcome Trust described it as the most significant health crisis of the 21st century. Alzheimer's Disease International reckon there are some 35.5 million people across the world with dementia, and it's calculated to cost something in the order of $315 billion a year to support people with dementia. And just very recently, we've got the World Health Organization coming out saying this is a key public health concern at the moment. And I'll come back to it as a public health issue as we move forward in this presentation as well. So what do we mean living with dementia? What's that actually like? What are our beliefs around that? Well, of course, there is a fairly strong view, mindset, that to have a diagnosis of dementia is something that's really quite catastrophic. Perhaps because of that notion of its implications for yourself, that it is a tragic thing to happen in someone's life. That for those families who are caring for people, and I use the word caring purposefully, it is a time of stress and burden. We had a mass of research in the 80s and 90s that told us this, that told us that carers of people with dementia experienced enormous stress and burden. And it was only towards the end of that period we got the odd voice coming out through research that talked about, well actually some people find it something where they feel they can give back to things that they maybe received earlier in a relationship, a time of reciprocity, a time of personal growth. But the overall sense remains that to be a carer of someone with dementia is a time of stress and burden. And indeed, one can't be a person with dementia without having a carer tagged onto you. There's also, of course, the sense that as a world, as a societies, we're faced with being overwhelmed by this tidal wave of dementia. And from my point of view, looking at risk and risk management, we've had quite an emphasis on staff focusing on the physical safety, protecting people from physical harm, and indeed families. So if we take that approach to understanding dementia, then we really take on board the values of dementia care as being ones that have this flow to it, so that there is a political economy of ageing that says all these older people, they're not productive, all that pressure on paying pensions, care needs and everything is falling on the never diminishing middle-aged band. How are we going to cope with all of that? Age is seen as a problem. Aging is seen as a problem. And we have what some people have called the structured oppression of older people. We have now at least stopped requiring people to be retired and things like that. But what that leads us to have is a care being delivered in a context, a societal context, where there's a high level of stigma. And what Kitwood talked about as malignant social psychology. So there was a social psychology, is a social psychology, around people with dementia that is very undermining, that is very depersonalizing of that person as a person. This is a quote from the Healthbridge project, which I'm not really supposed to say anything about yet because the Department of Health are going to sign it off at the end of this month, but haven't done yet. So Healthbridge was a project in which I led the national evaluation of the English National Dementia Strategy. And this was a quote from a commissioner. And she said, "You think of poor old souls sat around in chairs drooling." But she goes on to say, it's not like that at all. and this is what I want to challenge, is this perhaps popularist view of dementia as tragic and as somebody having no sense of self, of no soul. And we've had lots of very authoritative accounts that have talked about the social death of people with dementia, that they die before they're physically dead, things like that. So what do we mean when we're talking about living well with dementia? So in some of the work I've done, people with dementia and families have talked about, yes, they feel isolated, they experience changes in their family relationships, very mixed emotions on diagnosis. At one level, a sense of relief, because now they have an explanatory label for what they've been experiencing, but also a sense of that being a very difficult diagnosis because in part of their anticipated reaction of other people. Enormous challenges of getting appropriate support in place. And they also talk about ways in which they cope with their situation. So one of the things, and this is perhaps putting this in a slightly different way, but this has come out of a National Institute for Health Research Patient Benefit Award that I held, which we called Give and Take, or the G&T project, this one was. So I sometimes put it in my diary, G&T, and Linda, who manages my diary, said, what's this G&T stuff you've got in for a couple of hours on a Wednesday morning, Charlotte? But the people that we interviewed some 55 people with dementia on more than one occasion, plus the families, and they talked about how they work to maintain a sense of identity, how they try to maintain a facade around that sometimes. They think hard about who they want to share that diagnosis with. They talked about losing roles. They talked about losing confidence and social skills. And they talked about difficulties working with their GPs and things actually as well. And we kind of looked at this in terms of what would it look like if we use the social model of disability as a theoretical framework of understanding this, and built on an earlier project, a parallel project, where we talked about contested territories, and I'll come back to that. So there is something that people are going through, and people talk to us about in a number of studies, about in order to maintain a sense of being well, people engage in a process of re-narrating their lives, of retelling their story of their life. Like a lot of long-term conditions, dementia, a diagnosis of dementia comes crashing into your life, and you think you're on this trajectory, and suddenly the diagnosis actually sets you off on a different trajectory in life, and people retell a story around that. So really important for people to be able to re-narrate their life, their story, their sense of themselves. The importance of social networks to do that. We know that for people with dementia, social networks can fall away. So the importance of finding ways of keeping social networks there for people. The importance of having a purpose and having meaning. And I'll pick that up again later as well. It comes back to the rather ageist attitudes that perhaps society has, our society has, that kind of goes, older people, do they have a meaning? Do they have a purpose? You've got dementia as well. Well, surely there's no meaning or no purpose. Had you not just better hurry up and exit? We'll come back to that. I wanted to tell you a little bit briefly about Suzanne here, because Suzanne told a very interesting story about how she re-narrated her life. Now, Suzanne cares for her husband. She's his wife. She's not his carer. She sees herself as his wife. She talked about how initially, on diagnosis, how very embarrassed they were as a couple, he was, about the diagnosis. They talked about how all their pre-existing social networks and friendships and things rather faded into the distance, and how highly at risk she felt they were of her words, falling through a black hole. She engaged with some peer support, some support, and they've come through that and now talk about actually they can see how they now play a role in helping other people. So through peer support with other people with dementia, They found a role and a purpose, which is about supporting other people. And so she's gone on this journey, and she talked very eloquently about this journey of the embarrassment, the mortification of having the diagnosis, the absence, the perceived absence of any support as pre-existing structures fell away, but how they've re-established that with some support, how they've been able to re-establish that and re-narrate their future. So what are some of the challenges then? If we've got this context which is quite negative, and societal attitudes that are quite negative towards the experience of dementia, what are the challenges to move to that position so that everybody experiences a level of support in the way that Suzanne talks about? And yes, it's traumatic, but it doesn't have to stay at that point of being traumatic. And again, borrowing a lot from the kind of mindset of social model of disability, then some of the things are about using affirmative language. And if you think, even just, although I'm not as young as I care to think I am, but just in the time I've been working around dementia care, we've gone from calling people dements to demented people. We've gone on to talk about people with dementia, to now perhaps more than ever saying people who have a diagnosis of dementia. So we've recovered the person out of that what was once a dement. So the use of affirmative language. How do we go about living with dementia in a disabling society? How cognitively orientated is our society? How quickly are people outpaced, not given the time to get their head around what they need to get their head around in our society? We also, what's the scale of the opportunity here? What's the scale of the challenge, if you like? That is in the figures around the increased number of people with dementia and things are really a bit mind-blowing. So there is an enormous opportunity. It's propelled dementia to the forefront of policy concern. It's propelled dementia to the forefront of some research investment. It still gets a piddling amount of research investment compared to cancer and things like that. But it's there. We've just had an NIHR themed call around dementia, for example. We need to bear in mind how to do this, how to move forward in a way that is culturally sensitive and that takes on board different ideologies about quality of care. It is such a socially experienced illness, a socially experienced disease, that not every culture responds to it in the same way. So we did one study and led by a close colleague of mine, Catherine Gibb, and we took actually one of the projects that we'd done across the UK around risk construction, and we took that out to South Africa, and we used the same data collection tools, and Catherine interviewed people in some of the township communities and things. And to this day, there are still people who get stoned out of communities who are displaying signs of dementia. There are very poorly developed diagnostic tools in some parts of the world because they lack the cultural specificity. And then the final point I'll put on here is, how do we enable a quality of life through managing risk in a way that is enabling rather than controlling? And that's where a lot of my work is focused. Now, I wanted to put this quote up here from Steve Sabat. Steve's done some wonderful work around this area, but he said, "We should not let words rob people with dementia of their life story, their humanity, and a life yet to be lived." We shouldn't let dementia have that power, have that authority over people's biography and their sense of self, but it is us who need to not let those words rob them of that. I just want to play a little clip here. It's a publicly available little clip. I just think it puts it very nicely. Some of you may recognise this. It was produced by the Department of Health with the Alzheimer's Society.
I'm Carol Floyd. I have dementia. It's caused by Alzheimer's affecting my brain. I often forget things, and sometimes I repeat myself. It can happen to anybody, and I know it will get worse. But be patient with me, and don't run away when I say dementia. If everyone understands the condition more and helps out, I can still do many of the things I love. I have dementia. I also have a life.
Find out the simple ways to help someone living with dementia. Dementia, the more we understand.
And I think for me that just rather encapsulates in just a few seconds how someone can feel very diminished by a diagnosis of dementia, but actually in other contexts and in other forms of support can actually be enabled to still, make the most of the life they have and feel a very rich life. So we could perhaps say that there's a different set of values around dementia care. We don't have to adopt the values that I articulated earlier on. There is a more humanistic value set around dementia care that we can have that focuses on the meaning of people's lives, but it throws it back on us to be socially responsible and our society to be responsible for supporting diverse alternative definitions of ageing and of dementia, and to enable people to live the fullness of their lives. So if you like, we've maybe got two different ways of conceiving of this. We could see self as a cognitive entity. If we see self as something that's cognitive, then we see dementia as being very pervasive on our sense of self, and we see that person as a changed person. We see them as socially diminished and disabled by society. On the other hand, if we say self is a product of relationship, then we are reliant on other people for our self-identity. But that creates the potential for an individual's sense of self, selfhood, to be sustained by others and sustained by society. It creates hope, it creates a way of intervening that is so very different from saying self is locked into you as a cognitive entity. So I think we can ask ourselves questions, and I think all of this rather rotates around some of the complexity of the ideas on this slide. So does dementia cause us as a self to be intact or disintegrated? Does our self disintegrate when we have dementia? Or is there a way in which our self can remain intact? Are we enabled or are we impressed by the culture we live in and the society around us? And some of the dimensions, and only some of them, that I want to pick up on this presentation that are interacting that are around information and around risk and resilience. They are both very politically charged issues that can either enable or oppress, that can either support integration and intactness of self or actually accelerate disintegration and a sense of fragmentation. And I've set around this a context of human rights. And that's certainly something that I think we need to go to. Human rights is enormously important here. But depending on which stance we take, we may feel that human rights of individuals with dementia are or are not compromised. I've put this up. Now I'm going to show a few photographs during this presentation. So from the outset, I want to say thank you very much to my daughter, who has a knack of getting into far-flung places in the world and producing beautiful photographs that I can drop into presentations. So this is, I just thought this just sets a scene of how very different it can be in different countries and cultures. So this was the South, what's now South Sudan, independence, referendum. And this was a poster, Haboba, lead the way, others will follow. Old woman lead the way, others will follow. You wouldn't see that in this country, would you? The status afforded to older people is very different in other places. And I want to go on and talk about people working together, because this is not something that happens to a person only. The altered physiology happens to a person. The social experience, the societal experience involves all of us. working together across policy, across practice. And I just want to introduce you to Mary and Fred, two people who have been research participants with me in quite a while ago now, actually. Mary and Fred have got 2 children, lived in the same house all of their married life, fairly small house, 2 up, 2 down. A few years ago, Mary had a stroke, which has left a legacy of memory loss and dementia. Fred is her carer, her husband. Her physical needs are quite a bit, and he's been finding it increasingly hard to physically manage her around the house. So services said, that's fine, we can help. We'll send a carer in to help her get to bed. So carers came. Lasted for about 10 days, this arrangement, because the carer came at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, put Mary to bed upstairs. But it didn't take the couple long to go, do you know, actually we quite enjoy our evenings together. We don't really want Mary going to bed at 5 in the afternoon. So that arrangement didn't last. We go on this hunt to find ways of dealing with a problem. So well, that's fine, okay, but you'll have to move house then. Well, we've always lived in this house. This is our home. Well, you need to live in a bungalow. But there are no bungalows in the area. That means we'd have to leave the neighbourhood. We've always lived in this neighbourhood. Okay, well, we'll put a bed downstairs then. Great. Bathroom's upstairs, so commode goes downstairs. This is in the living room, because there's only the living room and the kitchen downstairs. So bed in the living room and the commode. A really core part of that community. They always had church meetings in the house. They can't have church meetings in the house now because Mary's got a commode down there. And actually for Fred, in the night time, he's still having to leg it up and downstairs all the time. In the end, Fred needed to go into hospital for surgery on his knee. Mary went into a care home for respite care, and she never went home again. And they never had time together as a couple again. Now, it's a classic story of hunting for a solution to a problem, and actually nobody ever finds the right solution. Nobody ever finds a solution. So if we look at that from a risk point of view, we can either understand people as vulnerable, in which case we've got to manage the risk, manage the potential harms, or we can say situations are vulnerable, in which case perhaps we can better enable people in their risk management, and we can support positive risk taking. If you see it as the person who's vulnerable, you come up with very individualistic situations. For Mary and Fred, all of the solutions proposed were about seeing her as a vulnerable person. Every solution proposed compromised the strengths and resources they drew from the situation they were in their community and things. So if we propose solutions that focus on somebody as vulnerable, we can actually create more harmful situations. So I don't think it's entirely unreasonable to say that risk management's one of the most complex parts of professional practice. It's also one of the parts of practice that can have an enormous impact on the quality of life of people. So we have a little bit of a juxtaposition between quality of life or physical safety. And one of the things I've spoken about, I'm going to explore now just a few concepts, if you like, but I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail around them. But I think just in terms of what can we learn that helps us understand how to work with people with dementia. So one concept is this notion of silent harms. What do we mean by that? It's very easy to focus on protecting people physically. It's very easy to say, well, we'll make sure that you're sitting and you're not going to fall down. Well, we can stop people falling down because we can give them medication and we can tie them and things. Well, we've moved on beyond doing that in this country at any rate. But sometimes in focusing on physical safety, we can neglect to focus on emotional well-being, that sense of biography, that sense of personal narrative. Those are the people who are often sitting rather passively. They're silent harms. Mike Titterton's a very good colleague who's based up in Edinburgh. And he's written about attending to physical safety only can lead to other needs being ignored, denying rights to choice and self-determination, loss of self-esteem and respect, a form of institutionalisation with loss of individuality, volition, and an increase in independence, and at its worst, can lead to an abuse of vulnerable people. So focusing on physical safety only is actually not a very good way to go. Another concept that I find enormously useful is around time framing, and how different people, different actors, if you like, in these situations, time frame in different ways. Classically, and what people have said to me time and time again in different research projects, is that that person with dementia, their family members, are time referencing backwards very often. They're privileging the person and they're seeking a narrative that brings that person through into the present day and into the future. As a professional, we're experts on what dementia is, and we often communicate that or feel the need to communicate that and to bring people into the future, if you like. We're time referencing forward and we're privileging dementia. I'll give you an example. One couple that I interviewed talked about, actually they just live day by day. That's the way they deal with it. They just take it day at a time. I spoke to their district nurse who said, that couple, they're totally in denial. I keep trying to tell them he's going to become doubly incontinent, but she just won't listen. And I'm like, really? Just why would you want to know that that's going to happen, sort of thing? Is it going to happen? That's maybe a particularly pointed example, but there's something about privileging the dementia if you're time referencing forward, and privileging the person if you time reference backwards. And there's a big clash there between what as professionals we often think we're trying to achieve and what a family are trying to achieve. So we actively undermine their coping strategies. It's an important point, it's an important aspect of risk management when we come to think about the provision of information, which has become quite an issue of ascendancy in policy and practice around dementia care. I think I've just said that. It's about what are we providing rather than what are we seeking to elicit from somebody. This is what the give and take study was about. The give and take, the G&T, referred to giving information and taking information, eliciting information about somebody. Another really key concept is around temporal accounting. I'm not sure you'll be able to read the detail there, but please don't worry about that. So this was a study where we talked to older people. Actually, they weren't necessarily people with dementia, and we spoke to these people in Germany, in Australia, in South Africa, and in the UK. And they talked about what their losses were as they experienced aging. They talked about what they anticipated losing. And some of that was about, I anticipate losing respect in my community because I'm an older person and things, particularly in the UK and in Germany, actually. People also talked about what their aspirations for the future were. And they talked about how important it was to them to get things right for future generations, to get things right for them as well. But actually there was a sense of urgency. It's like, we've got to get this right, and I'm not going to be around forever, so we've got to get it right now, sort of thing. But moreover, a sense of displacing an aspiration for oneself into an aspiration for wider family, wider community and things. And I'm not sure we appreciate that when we're working with older people. It's not that long ago that we were full of the disengagement theory and how older people withdrew from society and really didn't want to have anything to do with it, and that was fine because we could just park them somewhere. It's not true. So some of the things that we've got going on here about the duality of risk, how it can cause harm, but how it can also enhance quality of life? Do we see some body, some self, as a subject of society? Or are we providing leadership over a way forward? Are we seeing the individual at risk or society at risk? And it depends which way you spin the coin as to what we think the experience of somebody with dementia is. And that temporal accounting, meaning that people change their life goals, what they aspire for when they're 80 and 90 is very different from what they aspire for when they're 20 and 30. We have to allow and recognise and benefit from that maturation of life goals. I put this up just to say it's complicated. So this is a complex network of ideas and things. And just want to give you a couple of examples from a couple of projects that I was involved in. This is the Risk Construction and Dementia Project, Health Foundation funded. And one part of that, we spoke to a lot of practitioners and a lot of different agencies, healthcare, social care, also voluntary sector, about what they felt the dilemmas were that they were faced with. So they talked about the challenges of balancing independence and autonomy with exposure to potential harm. They talked about it not being enough to maintain safety and protection from harm, physical harm. They talked about the dilemmas they were faced with around risk assessment being very complex and having a very profound influence on the nature of the care that was being provided. They sought to seek certainty, but actually they're working in situations where there's an enormous amount of uncertainty when you're working professionally. Very complex situations. People talked about being quite risk averse. The tick box approach, I filled in the risk assessment sheet. I've done that, filed it, done. Risk assessment sorted. Not using risk assessment in its most constructive form. They talked a little bit about enabling risky activities, but also how they had enormous challenges in doing that. So, for example, one situation was where the gentleman wanted to go swimming. He'd always swum. That's what he did in his life, was go swimming regularly. But for whatever reason, the care staff, and he lived in the community, said, actually, it's not very safe for you to go swimming. We're not going to support you to go swimming. So he said, well, that's fine. And just went as a member of the public down to the swimming pool and went swimming. You know, I mean, so there's a lot of risk aversity, but also how do you go about enabling risky activities? And another really important idea, concept, if you like, is what I came to call risk repair, where we're maybe working in situations where there is some element of potential harm, but it can be mitigated. I'll give you an example here, and this was a PhD student of mine who was working with older people who had diabetes from a South Asian background. And what she found people talked about was the dilemma they were faced with if they were going to visit somebody. Culturally would be offered food, sweet food. They know that's not great for their diabetes, but they know too it's socially offensive to decline that hospitality. So people made conscious decisions about repairing the damage to their blood sugar levels by increasing insulin, then felt they would be unable to repair the social damage by saying thank you but no thank you. Practitioners also talked a lot about feeling that they were being judged by other colleagues, by family members and things. So they had a fear of being judged. And that amongst a team there were multiple views of what the right thing to do is. So it became very hard for them to keep the person right at the centre of decision making. So sometimes their employing organisation had a different view on what was okay to do than family members, and the practitioner and the wider society all had slightly different views on the right course of action would be. And because this is something that cuts across lots of different agencies, you got a lot of issues that were spinning around between health services and social services and things. So it's a medical problem, no, it's a social problem, it's a cultural problem, it's the family's problem, it's your problem. A lot of passing around. And Andy Alashevsky has done some lovely work around risk, not necessarily in dementia. And he's talked about practitioners having 3 core roles that they tend to adopt. So they may understand risk as a hazard, in which case the practitioner becomes a hazard manager. They may see risk as potentially empowering, in which case they're a facilitator of risk, or risk as a dilemma, in which case you're a negotiator and you're managing all these multiple views. It's useful to think of that. I want to go to a different way. So where we talked there about practitioners working with people with dementia and their families, let's talk now about those homes, that very personal home space in which people are living with dementia. And this was another aspect of that risk construction and dementia project that we were working with. And it's where, if you like, we might all care to think of our homes as being non-threatening places where we're not under surveillance, there are habitual routines. It's a place of comfort and security for us. But what happens when you introduce dementia? When somebody's diagnosed with dementia, Janet Askham talked about how the domestic home runs the risk of adopting characteristics of total institution. Remember Goffman's work on total institutions, with the mortification of the self, with routinization, and with high levels of surveillance. And that's your own home. Most of us choose not to go home to feel mortified, to be locked into routines that are inflexible and to feel under surveillance. And Kate Galvin talked about the carer being positioned as a mediator between that private experience and public services. So everyday life becomes something that's very unstable, and you've got competing expectations of adulthood with dementia. But each person, the practitioner, the carer, the person with dementia, trying to work together. And I want to read to you a quote from one of the interviews that we did in this study, which I think just kind of captures some of the tensions, this contested territories that we talked about through the analysis. And this is a lady, Mary, who lived with her partner. And so this is Mary, the person with dementia, talking. I miss doing things most people do. Go shopping. Now and again I sneak out. I don't tell Peter because he'll go off it. He doesn't like me going out unless there was someone with me. I mean, everybody in the street knows me, even in the shop. But if you want something, you tell me and I'll bring it up. And I think, well, I'm sitting here doing nothing and I could be around and back, but he'll not have it. I think he's frightened in case I take a wrong turning and I don't know where I am. But I cannot possibly take a wrong turning where we live. What do you want to go in there? You should have told me, I would have brought it in. And I think, oh man, give it a rest. She's very articulate. Headmistress, experiencing a high degree of surveillance in her own home. But what are these contested territories actually doing? What are they helping people achieve? Well, they help people achieve trying to make sense of the situation they find themselves in. It's also a way of maintaining an identity. She says, I miss doing the things women do, going shopping. It's about her finding a way of sustaining her identity. She talks elsewhere in her interview of, they used to do the dishes together. You know, one wash, one dry, fairly common scenario in a household. But she started putting the dishes away in the wrong place. And so he told her not to bother, and she says, and I feel useless. People claiming and relinquishing decision-making, and about creating purpose and purposelessness. And when we published this paper, one of the reviewers came back and said, I don't know what you mean by creating purposelessness. How can you do that? What does that mean? But I think it absolutely does mean that. Some of these tensions, these very interpersonal tensions, actually create a lack of purpose for people in their lives. Taking away going shopping with her friends, taking away, putting the dishes away, for, if you like, from Peter's point of view, all the right reasons. So we talked about these contested territories, through these contested territories, how everyday life has a very dynamic nature in which each party is trying to attenuate or amplify an understanding of risk and its management. But when you go back to what John Bond talked about diagnosis of dementia may lead to professional judgments about lack of insight and to depersonalisation and loss of independence, irrespective of the probability of risk. So it sounds fine, but we're not far away from that first value set that I articulated at the beginning, really. So people's constantly trying to reconcile, and therefore the need to re-narrate, not just their lives and their life story and its future, but re-narrate their relationships together as well. So, Dorothy kindly mentioned that the book on your left there won the BMA Book Award for 2012, which I was really delighted about. Firstly, because it was a book about dementia, which has never been the sort of fanciest area to work in. Secondly, because it was around risk theory, which is a bit dry sometimes. And thirdly, because it was written by nurses, and the BMA don't allow their books awards to, you're not allowed to put forward books that are about nursing. So I kind of thought, cool. So just some key messages: how to support quality of life through positive risk-taking, enable people to manage uncertainty, avoid unnecessary dependence, ensure that there's effective advocacy of the views of people with dementia and involve them in decision-making, ensuring that assessment includes psychosocial and emotional well-being, not just physical safety, and ensuring that there is good communication between services. And if I focus in a little bit more on information, because it's a really key part of national dementia strategies, it's something that people have taken hold of and said, dementia, we can do something about that, we can give people information. But information has never been a neutral thing. It's always been packed full of politics and power and things. So what does that mean? What are we giving people? Are we giving people a bundle of leaflets in a plastic bag? Like when you go and have a baby, you get a plastic bag, don't you? Do we give people a plastic bag full of leaflets that say, this is what dementia is, this is what's going to happen to you in the future? Or do we use information that's about eliciting our understanding of them and themselves? So to get that right for people with dementia, we've got to, in order to maintain autonomy, we've got to hear people, not just tell people. We need to provide information, we absolutely do, but why? We've also got to allow it to be a vehicle through which people are enabled to be part of decisions and enabled to be active in that decision-making process, and they maybe need our support to do that. That information has to be provided in a way that is appropriate to them. The other book I had on the slide just there came out at the same month as the risk book, actually. It was a busy year before then. And it's about nursing older people, not specifically about dementia. And in it, we asked every chapter author to front their chapter with something that an older person had written. And the chapter that's about communication has the most powerful message in it. And it's been written by someone who is a carer, a husband of somebody with dementia. And he tells the story of how he had to go into hospital for some routine, fairly minor surgery, but he was in hospital for a couple of days. He was worried about his wife. And so he asked whether somebody could, was there any way someone could supply meals or something like that? He didn't want to bother his daughter. What he got given was a plastic bag. He talks about this, a plastic bag full of leaflets. And when he emptied the plastic bag of leaflets out on the bed in front of him, it had all sorts in there, including, planning your funeral and things like that. And he talks about how distressed he was. So the information we give has to be appropriate, absolutely appropriate. It's very damaging otherwise. We have to recognise that if we tell people about dementia, we are disrupting that biographical narrative of self, or can do. We've got to tell it in a way that supports that narrative. We have to share knowledge and information in a two-way sense. And we have to understand that disability isn't inherent in that individual. It is us as a society that disables. We discriminate. We put barriers in people's way. We have to look at how dementia is represented in literature and in the media and things like that. I talked before about dements and demented people and things like that. But many of us will have also read books that talk about the dementor, in which the dementor is a character that sucks your soul out. Most of our children have read those books. Very important books, very powerful books. Tad unfortunate. Dementia is so how it's represented in the media is key, and we need to understand it within a public health context, because public health look at literature, they look at information, they look at health literacy. And we need to learn from that field and say, well, what does that mean in dementia? So you can't go far in the world without being asked to proclaim yourself, declare yourself. What does that mean? So this was a sign that, this is from Pakistan actually, if you struggle to, how would you feel if you couldn't answer that question? And I grew up, and this is where I took the title from in a way. My daughter put this little postcard up on her bedroom door for most of her childhood, actually. I don't know what that means, but mine. But it's always stayed with me. I thought, what does that mean? For a minute there, I lost myself. What does losing oneself actually mean? So where does this take us? What can it look like in the future? What do I think some of the key research areas need to be? I think we absolutely not just need to position dementia in public health research. Those in dementia are already moving towards saying this is a public health agenda. What we need is mainstream public health to go, dementia is an important issue for us too. Some of the pieces of work that I'll just mention quickly. We've got a bid out for the moment working with the police force and the search and rescue team about how to work with people, how to search for people who've been reported missing, but also how do people respond to the anxiety that someone might go missing? And we know that one version of that is, well, we'll lock people in their houses. I'm going to work, so I'm going to lock my mum in her house. Well, when does that cross over into a violation of human rights? How hard is that decision to make? We've got some work shaping up around discharge management from acute care settings that actually say, well, how can we maximise people's resilience, manage risk at that point in time? Looking at lay health workers, peer support, building on the health bridge work. I've put a shed in a community allotment. I'm very excited about this. This isn't really a piece of research. It's not even really to do with work, but it is in a way. Because one of the things that I'm just in the process of establishing where I live is a shed, and in Australia they have a community model particularly for older retired men, but also for people with dementia. It's about purposeful activity. So that we'll have a shed. So I've got a building that's in the village that has been a youth club that's never been used recently. The youth don't seem to want to go there. It's a bit run down. And the village have just agreed that it can be developed now as a facility for older people and older people with dementia. Fantastic. I can't wait to get in there and refurbish it and fill it with whatever people want to be in there that enable purposeful activity. And neighbouring this is a piece of land that's not used. And I've had a word with the parish council about, can we develop a community allotment? And somebody in the village has come along and say, oh, you know, my job is to work with sensory gardens and things. Like, fantastic. So that's quite exciting, but perhaps it's not work or research. We're also developing work around using SCI Art, and it's something that a number of people in the school are interested in. But this is about how can we create a public awareness of dementia in a way that is about enabling and supporting quality of life. So one of the things we did coming out of the Risk and Resilience project that we've recently completed, we worked with a drama group called Skimstone Art, and they took the transcripts and they developed a play from that, and we've had the premiere of it. It was fantastic, and we've just heard we've got it into the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So in August there'll be a 7-day run of Jack and Jill and the Red Post Box, which is all about living with dementia, down at the Grass Market. Very excited about that. I want to kind of move on and not talk about dementia, but actually say this journey, this wonderful experience. What have I learnt along the way? What have been, for me, some of the really key messages? And I've worked with some fantastic people who I've learnt so much from. So I've just encapsulated on this some of the things that, for me, I think were very important learning. So I worked with two people, Sue Proctor and Jan Reid, both professors of nursing, who had written a book called Practitioner Research, The Inside Story, not long before I had the opportunity to join them. It was fantastic. They were saying, don't ignore the fact that you're a nurse. I am a nurse, you didn't mention that, I am a nurse. Don't ignore the fact you're a nurse. You take that knowledge, you take that sense of what being a nurse is, or any practitioner, into your research. You don't have to wipe clean, no? And we've moved on a lot since then about our ideas about reflexivity and things like that. This was really insightful stuff at that time. One of them in particular was wonderful, and she was always adamant. She said, you'll never get a paper written if you just go to meetings. Now, I'm not advocating that people stop coming to meetings, please. But on the other hand, meetings don't write. They really, really instilled in me a belief that we need to do with and not on, and particularly some of the older people that I've worked with collaboratively on projects, do things with people, not on people. I think Sue Proctor really, a light bulb moment. It's okay not to know things. I think I'd felt as a much younger person, it was really important to know everything. And if I didn't quite know it, then I kind of pretended I did and hoped nobody would find out. And she was so cool about not knowing things. I just thought that was so liberating. And actually, we can't do research if we don't know things. If we think we know it all, then we wouldn't be doing research about it. So to not know things is really, really important. And working together is absolutely key. So I wanted to just read this little poem to you. So I've spent my life writing academically in a way that I feel very self-conscious of. I managed to fail my English O-level. So to me, writing is something that has come as a great surprise to me that I can do this. And then Mary Marshall, very, very famous person in the dementia field, and Jane Gilliard as well, approached me, and they were writing a book about time. And they asked me to do a chapter in this book, and they said, but you've got 1,000 words. Time, dementia, 1,000 words. So I thought, my goodness, how am I going to do that? And I found myself writing this. And it's a reflection back on a clinical experience that I had when I was working as a nurse. And I'll just read it to you. 1980s, rehabilitation ward they called it, but few ever left alive. Edward, let's call him that, wordlessly seeing out his days, silent with his fragile dignity. Early shift. Time to get Edward up, talking, monologue, not expecting any answer. Gardening, Edward's job in years before, lettuce and the problem of slugs. slug pellets, slug salt rings, jars of beer, tried them all. Any suggestions? Don't grow them. A silence broken, but instantly returns forever for Edward. I don't grow lettuce now. Such ecological wisdom didn't think like that in the 80s, so ahead of his time. Few words, big lesson that has shaped my life. Work with, not against. Thank you, Edward. Now, when I first wrote that, I found that so hard. It was probably the hardest thing I've ever written, because writing in that format is so much more personal than writing a 5,000-6,000 word article or something. Very, very hard. And I found it very hard to share at first as well. I still do. I'm a little bit kind of, oh, can't believe I've read that out. But it also feels very important to me that this person, and these literally were the only words he said for the last few months of his life, that 25, 30 years on, he has a presence and he's here with us now. And I have learnt a lot from him. And you know, in a way, being able to enable him to be present with us is a really lovely thing to be able to do. So I think ways of communicating are so important. But for me, that was an enormous lesson. Now, what's research like? What's it been like? Well, sometimes it's been like absolutely jumping into the unknown and going, oh my goodness, how are we going to do this project? What's this going to be like? Sometimes it's been like, actually not sure which way to turn here. I don't know whether to go left or right. Sometimes it's felt kind of like there is so much, and actually I'm not too sure where to start with all of this, but there's a lot of it. And it has sometimes felt a very isolating, very on my own experience as well. Even within teams, and fantastic teams, it's felt very on my own, if you like, at times. And sometimes it's felt like it's been somewhat harder work than it ought to be. But it's also been full of surprises and some wonderful moments. And moments when it all comes together and you go, hey, wonderful. And really exciting sometimes as well. But working with teams and working with people is absolutely critical. So I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to all of the various teams in my life, including my family and my colleagues. This is the first team I was part of. I was the eldest of 4. My mum deserves an enormous thank you for coping with 4 of us. Thank you, Mum. I moved pretty seamlessly into adding into this family, my own family. And I've also worked with, and this is just a small selection of the myriad people who I've worked with on research projects, that I've published with. There are very, very many more people who have been involved in the work that I've done and things. And it has been an absolute pleasure to work with everybody, with all those teams. So that's really all I wanted to say. I think there's an enormous amount of work to be done around dementia and taking that forward. But it's been very exciting for all that it's been very challenging to do so as well. Thank you.
Well, that was a wonderful inaugural lecture. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Now, Charlotte's very kindly agreed to take a couple of questions, if anyone has any, but then we can also, you're all very welcome to come out to the reception afterwards, just in the foyer outside, and obviously we'll have a bit more informal discussion, and Charlotte will be available to talk to all of you then. But are there 1 or 2 questions that anyone would like to ask now?
What I'd like to ask is about how it's ways in which it might be possible to maintain that sense of accomplishment that you talk about when, when aspects of ourselves are diminishing, So I think people can have a sense of their inner selves growing when their outer selves are beginning to fail. And it's challenging to think about how that happens when the mind is going and not just the body. And so I wondered if you could have something to say about when people get to a stage where they're harder and harder to reach. You said it a bit with the poem about Edward, but whether there is a sense that people can go on growing in some way whilst their minds and bodies are diminishing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we know quite how that happens. We know that people have a sense of personal growth in older age that is perhaps takes a different hue to it than younger people. We also know that it takes very little to completely undermine people's sense of confidence and self-esteem, and that's that very damaging form of psychosocial undermining that Tom Kitwood talks about as well. How very easy it is to reinforce or give people a sense of belief that they are diminishing, that they are gone, if you like. I think some of my work more recently has been trying to focus on resilience, almost more than risk, to make that shift across. It's actually quite a difficult shift across to make. I think children and young people mental health have always held risk and resilience hand in hand. That doesn't happen with older people so much. But we've been trying to develop some work that would actually say, well, how can we build resilience? How can people's sense of self, if you like, be maintained? And I think of it a little bit as this is a very undeveloped thought in a way, but I think there's something about needing or having or us providing a almost exoskeleton of somebody's sense of themselves. So if somebody's got physical frailty, well, we can give them a Zimmer frame and, we can give them literally a frame. But what does that look like if it's something about identity and self and things? We think some of the ingredients are around peer support, are about information, but about supporting the purposeful use of information to enable people to continue to be part of decision making and be included in what's going on in their lives. But it's actually articulating what that could look like, I think is something we really need to do. And I do at present think of it as like, what's that skeleton of self that people need to have?
The examples you gave were of spouses looking after spouses. In view of the fact that statistically so many people are going to be living on their own now and getting old and dotty, the problem is just really rather frightening, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. I have only used examples of spouses, haven't I? But not all of the work I've done is focused on spouses. There have been plenty of children who are carers as well, for example. And also, you're right, the challenge of people living on their own brings a different dimension, actually. Sometimes people are on their own in terms of not having any family around. Sometimes people are living on their own and have relatives elsewhere, and it's often, of course, the relatives elsewhere who are particularly concerned to maintain safety for a mother or a grandmother or something like that, and acquire a sense of safety for their relative if they are, say, in a care home or something like that. So it's often there is a little bit of a dynamic of it actually being family members who say, I will feel happier if they're not living on their own and they're in a care home or something like that. But there are particular challenges, around people who are older and living on their own with dementia. Sustaining independent living is quite a challenge. Thank you. Thank you.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.